Well, evidently from our reading this morning, we are returning to our expositions in the book of Acts. Acts chapter 12 opens, as we've just had it read to us a few moments ago, it commences with drama. Real drama. It's a dramatic part of the story in the book of Acts. It's a record of a fresh wave, we might call it, of persecution that actually had then at this point broken out upon the Christian citizens who were living in Jerusalem. It's somewhere around the year 44 AD when we read the first few verses here in Acts 12. The first part of Acts 12, or Acts 12 entirety, is really a long way from, it's a world away from what happened in the earlier years in the church's beginning in Jerusalem. That season that we've studied before of rich blessing, of God's favor that was poured out upon those new converts gathered together in this first church. 14 years roughly have passed since those early days where thousands were converted. And now as we come to Acts 12, it's a season again of persecution or great trial. And I say again because if you remember, they've already had a season of persecution. In the year 34, they endured that first round of persecution. Remember the scene. Stephen was martyred. The rise of Saul of Tarsus and his influence and the terrorizing that he caused. That was the first wave of persecution there, especially as it began in Jerusalem. Now, 10 years after that, the fire of persecution was blazing again. And so as we come to Acts chapter 12, we need to recognize if you were a Christian, at this point, in AD 44, in Jerusalem, being a Christian was tough. It was really tough. But that is the Christian life, is it not? The Christian life is certainly not always a bed of roses. God in His mercy does lead us sometimes beside and to those still waters. We can lie down as sheep not feeling threatened, and we can be in the green pastures. We have those seasons, but it's not always like that. Sometimes being a Christian can be very hard. Sometimes being a Christian can cost us dearly. It can cost us maybe friendships. And some of you have experienced that. And it can even cost Christians their very life. And so you see, the Christianity that we read of in the Bible is not one of endless fulfillment of all of our dreams and all of our delightful hopes. The idea that the Christian life is one of ceaseless happiness, where you have a constant stream of wealth coming into your bank account, where you have unending, brilliant physical health, and you always have a long life because you have been born again of the Spirit, that idea that's around today just does not fit Acts chapter 12. It doesn't fit many other passages of the Bible. It doesn't fit many things Jesus said, but it certainly doesn't fit what we are looking at this morning in Acts 12. And yet what we also see in Acts 12 is just simply showing us ordinary Christians in many ways. Ordinary Christians who are part of a local church. They're not off doing their own thing. They're together in the local body. And it's a church that prays together. And powerful things happen. And so the primary lesson I would like to underscore, and no doubt there are many other lessons in this passage, but the primary one that's on my heart as we see it here is that Acts chapter 12 shows us the power of corporate prayer. In times of difficulty or trial, it is sadly too often the case that for many Christians, prayer is the last resort, not the first port of call. And a prayer meeting is regarded by most Christians today as the least important meeting to attend. Well, that whole mindset does not fit the perspective of the early church as we have seen it in Acts chapter 1, as we have seen it in Acts chapter 2 in our previous studies, as we have seen it in Acts chapter 4, and now again we see it in Acts chapter 12. Leonard Ravenhill said this: Sunday morning shows how popular the church is. Sunday night shows how popular the preacher is. And the prayer meeting shows how popular God is. When God permits Satan to light a fire of persecution again, it ought to drive the church to prayer. And that's what we find in Acts chapter 12. God permitted the evil one to light the fire of persecution again, and it drove the church to be where it should always be, in prayer. And that's in the context of a hostile, very hostile world. And that's our day. And so as we look at the narrative this morning, I want to just simply break it into two sort of main categories. We're going to look at the cruel persecution and simply try and understand what was going on there. And then we're going to look at corporate prayer. Okay, they're the two things: cruel persecution, corporate prayer. As we think about persecution, there is nothing pleasant in many ways about the human experience of Christian persecution. And without doubt, Satan's hatred stands behind it. The devil does walk about this earth, and he is roaring as a lion roars, seeking somebody or some people to devour. That's Peter's description of the evil one in this world now. He is a cruel enemy. And we see that here right from the start of the chapter in verse 1. When Luke describes this persecution in this way, giving us the setting and the who's involved, where he says, now about that time, Herod the king stretched out his hand to harass some from the church. Herod's a politician. And Herod had found a new political strategy. Harass the Christians, and I'll stay in favour with the majority, that is, with the Jews in town. We might call this good old-fashioned political expediency. It's coming from a pragmatic politician who is hungry for popularity. Isn't that the same type of policy that goes on today in our world? Get rid of the Christians. They're saying things that we think, the world thinks this way, doesn't it, today? They're saying things that we don't like to hear, so let's get rid of the Christians, remove them from the workplace, remove them from the sporting field, remove them from anything in public. Let's get rid of the Christians. It's a popular planet all over a popular policy all over the planet still in the context of pagan government. But really, when we stop and think about it from a biblical worldview, from an understanding of what Jesus says, that policy, that pagan policy of the world or politicians, that is actually a very bad policy for their own societies. What am I saying? Well, to remove the salt and to remove the light from any society is to write a death sentence over that society. For instance, to remove the salt, that might be popular in the short term, but the culture will corrupt in the long term. And so Herod might have thought that he was onto something here by this policy, but this, could I say, was a really dumb idea, King Herod. It's a dumb idea for your jurisdiction. It's a dumb idea for Jerusalem and that region. It's a dumb policy. And yet his thinking was, wouldn't it even be a better idea, not just to harass some of the Christians, but wouldn't it be a better idea to get rid of the leaders? Wouldn't it be a better idea to get rid of one of the 12, like those Jesus ones? Verse 2 says, then he killed James, the brother of John, with the sword. So not just, we might say, not just one of the 12, but one of the 3, Peter, James and John, the 3 closest to the Lord Jesus. Let's get rid of James. So he kills James. James suffered. Not much is told to us here. It's an interesting little description compared to Stephen's martyrdom, where there's great detail. We just got one short little description in this verse, but we have enough to know that he suffered a horrible end. Death by sword, presumably his head was removed. Now think again about the policy, the political strategy. Well, it was working. It was pragmatism. It was working. It was successful policy, verse 3 says. And because he saw that it pleased the Jews with what he just did with James, he proceeded further to seize Peter also. And now he's thinking, wow, what a prize this would be. Peter, he's the main spokesman of the group. He is really been the main leader of the group from the very beginning. He's always the guy that pops his head up and wants to be the spokesman for the people. He's the guy to knock off surely next. He's the main leader. Scripture says, strike the shepherd and the sheep scatter. That's one of Satan's oldest tactics. He attacks shepherds. You notice the timing when all this occurred? Look at the end of verse 3. Now it was during the days of unleavened bread. So when he had arrested him, he put him in prison and delivered him to 4 squads of soldiers to keep him, intending to bring him before the people after Passover. Now I can spy Satan's cruelty in the timing of this. Can you? Just think about it for a moment. What time is this? It's Passover time. This is the 14th anniversary since the death of Christ that happened at Passover time. The devil can be very cruel. Very cruel. His timing was like knocking the old scab off the slowly healing wound. Every year for 14 years at that very time of year, surely the people couldn't help, the Christians couldn't help but remember all the cruel things related to the horrific death of their leader that happened in the midst of that Jewish feast, and that Jesus is the true Passover lamb. This is Satan's form, I suggest. Just when you're down as a Christian, the devil likes to sink the boot in. Have you experienced such satanic cruelty? I have. So I'm suggesting that the timing of the persecution was designed to maximize the pain for the Christians, to engender greater fear in the hearts of the Christians. First James is taken from them. Now Peter is heading in the same direction, and it's Passover time. And as we look at Peter in prison, look at the security force that's been employed. Don't you think it's a little over the top? Peter and James were not exactly guerrilla fighters. They're a couple of retired fishermen who are probably by this stage in their mid-40s, for crying out loud. How many soldiers does Herod assign to these retired fishermen? 4 squads of soldiers, Luke says. And in the case of this particular story, we're given more information, aren't we, as was read to us before. 2 of those soldiers are chained to Peter, and another 2 of those soldiers are stationed at the door. I'll just drop down to verse 6. It says, when Herod was about to bring him out, the night Peter was sleeping, bound with 2 chains between 2 soldiers, and the guards before the door were keeping the prison. I'm suggesting there's 2 guards there. The reason I'm saying that is it's one of the things that's sometimes understood here is that the Roman soldiers probably worked a 6-hour shift. 4 6-hour shifts rotating cover 24-hour periods, so that you've got that guy completely covered any time of the day or night. You know it. 4 by 4 gives you 16 soldiers assigned to look after Peter. Verse 10, as we read it before, goes on to say that there was a first guard post, and then there was a second guard post that Peter was able to slip past as he gets out of that prison, and then there was the main gate entrance that he had to get out as well. In other words, some would suggest Peter is actually held in the inner prison. James has just lost his head. Peter is locked up with the guards, with all these bolts and with all these doors and with all this security. He's in the inner prison. His fate seemed sealed. He's under heavy guard. And as verse 6 does say at the start, when Herod was about to bring him out. He's about to bring him out. It's normally understood that the very next day, after the events described in this story, the very next morning, it was when he was going to be coming out of that prison cell, but not for a lunch break or a toilet break. It was the last time he'd come out of that cell. He had an appointment with a sword. That was what was anticipated, according to what is suggested there at the start of verse 6. And with that of what was anticipated, what then does Luke say? And it seems like it doesn't fit. When Herod was about to bring him out that night, Peter was, what? Sleeping. With the anticipation of the next morning that he is about to feel the effect of a Roman sword, what is Peter doing but sleeping? How would you go? You're chained to 2 smelly Roman soldiers. You're lying on a hard floor. Remember the time of year, it's Passover time. Remember some years before, we got a bit of an idea of the climate at that time in Jerusalem, because even this same Peter, remember at Passover time, he was round the fire. What was he doing? He was warming himself because it's cool that time of year. You're in the prison. It's a hard prison. You're tied up to 2 smelly Roman prisoners, and it's a cold prison cell. Not exactly 5-star accommodation. Certainly not the modern prison system. And Peter's asleep. But especially, not just the physical environment, not just all the factors that would work against you and me probably, having such a lovely sleep, because we're so used to all of our comforts on our beds and our pillows and our pillow top things on top of our mattresses and everything else that we've got to give us the comfort that we must have these days to get a good night's sleep. Peter doesn't have even that, but that's not even the main issue of the passage, is it? Imagine you're Peter, and you are going to lose your head by a Roman sword in the morning. Are you relaxed? Are you chilled in your Jerusalem suite? Probably not. I would say it would be a sleepless night, certainly a restless night, and I would be a little highly strung. We call it stress. Oh, friends, do not we get a glimpse here of the solid faith of Peter on this very night, that he trusted in his God at such a time that he was asleep. It's like a passing reference, but it's amazing when you stop and think of the context. As David says in Psalm 4 and verse 8, I will both lie down in peace and sleep. For you alone, O Lord, make me dwell in safety. Peter seems persuaded that his life was completely safe, that no one could take his life until God decided that it was time for him to have a promotion to glory. And why waste a good night's sleep, eh? No one can hasten that day. No, the devil can't. And Herod can't. I can lie down in peace and sleep in an uncomfortable cell, knowing what's coming tomorrow, because God makes me dwell in safety. What a wonderful thing to live through and experience that. An explanation, what I'm trying to give you is an explanation as to how Peter could sleep. But I think there's another explanation, and it's in the passage, and it takes us to the second thing, and it's the primary thing for us to look at. It's corporate prayer. Yes, it's connected. Look at verse 5. Peter was therefore kept in prison. Okay, there's that scene. And now Luke's just injecting this that he expands later. But constant prayer was offered to God for him by the church. Here's the saints in the church at Jerusalem. Here's the members gathering together. Oh Lord, strengthen Peter's faith. Oh Father, give him courage as he faces his death tomorrow, as you did to James in answer to our prayer. Will you not do to Peter? Oh God, give him peace. Give him that peace that humans cannot comprehend. Lord, grant to our brother and our leader and our highly esteemed friend, grant him peace. Well, we don't have the record of what they prayed, but perhaps it's something like that. Could that not be another explanation, friends, as to why Peter could sleep just before the execution? That's why he was so calm. As he is in prison, verse 5 shows us him in prison, and then it quickly interjects and shows us God's people are praying. Here we see the power of prayer. And I want to underscore quickly three things about this prayer, this corporate prayer as I'm calling it. Three things that come to us out of this text. The obvious and most clearly stated one for us to get is they prayed corporately. They prayed corporately. Again, look at verse 5. It says, constant prayer was offered to God for him by the church. Now, I guess you could read that as the Christians were constantly praying privately for him, and so the church in a generic, general sense prayed for him, but it actually doesn't say that. It says prayer was offered to God for him by the church. That is the church. What's a church? What's the word church mean? It means the assembly of God's people. But if that's all we've got, then we've probably not got a strong argument, but that's not all we've got. Because verse 12 goes on to fill in the details and show us more clearly what was going on. And so if we go to verse 12, it says, so when he had, as Peter considered this, he came to the house of Mary, the mother of John, whose surname was Mark, where many were gathered together praying. We see where they are. Here is this woman, Mary. The context of who she is told us. The family relationship is told us. She's the mother of Mark, the author of the Gospel, Mark. His full name is John Mark. And so this lady is Mary Mark. That's her name. Mrs. Mark, we might commonly call her today. Evidently, she's a wealthy woman Her house, and we say that because her house is large enough to accommodate their prayer meeting, and it tells us explicitly at the end of verse 12 that many were gathered together praying. We've seen the word many times in the book of Acts, and their many is probably a lot more than our many, if you know what I'm saying. But there's many here. This is a big house, big enough to be able to accommodate them. And as we get the scene, the whole scene of the servant girl that comes up later, she goes out to the front gate. That helps us to understand what's going on and how big is this complex. It's likely one of those larger houses in those days where there's this gate that's at the front near the road, as it were, and then there is the house, but if you like, in the middle there's this inner courtyard, this large place which would very easily be able to assemble lots of people who could come together to pray. I love this part of the story, several parts of the story, I guess, but this part in relation to the scene of the house and Mary and where she fits in and her heart, it gives us an insight into this woman. It gives us an insight into her gospel focus. It gives her an insight into the kingdom priority that this woman has in her life when it comes to her material possessions, even her house. I have a house, Lord. You've given me a big house. I want to use that house for gospel purposes. I've got a house that many can gather in. Lord, I want to open the doors so that your people could come and gather here in a place that's appropriate to be together, where it's relatively safe. Lord, you've entrusted this into my hands. I am a steward before you. Help me to use it for your glory. Help me to use it not just for my comfort, but for the furtherance of your gospel, for the extension of your kingdom, for the strengthening of the church of Christ in this needy city. Do you love this woman? Her heart to want to use the things that God had entrusted to her, not to spoil on herself, but to use it for God's glory and for the benefit of God's people. And so they came together. They happily came to gather. Ordinary Christians, they don't have names, they're just ordinary yous and me's. They came out midweek to gather as a church to do nothing else but to pray together. They're not lobbying the government. They're entreating heaven. That's what they're doing, as the end of verse 12 says, that many were gathered together praying. They're crying out to the king above when the king around them is harassing them. They're crying out to the one who rules above the throne of Herod. They're crying out and they're pleading together in prayer. And in answer to their corporate prayer, an angel came. I love what Thomas Watson, the Puritan, says. He says, the angel fetched Peter out of the prison, but it was prayer that fetched the angel. Isn't that good? The angel did fetch Peter out of the prison, but back up a bit, and it was prayer that fetched the angel down. Why was Peter not stressed and restless in sleep? God's people gathered together to pray. I do think this is so relevant for our day, where so many Christians, in a way that perhaps has not been seen in Western society before, so many Christians are super stressed today. And I wonder whether there is actually a connection in the contemporary church which has largely given up on the prayer meeting. I wonder if there is a connection. I wonder how much stress would vanish if the church learned to pray corporately again. Christians were committed to attend the prayer meeting. Certainly when these, no doubt, would have been stressed Christians gathered with the local church to pray, we know this, powerful things happen. The forces of darkness are too strong for us. Sin, has such a binding hold on this world. Its system is stacked against us. We can't overcome it in our own capacity, in our own ideas, in our own strength, and certainly not individually and by ourselves. We need to gather together to plead with heaven to come in power and to work mightily again today. Peter was locked up in prison. He's barred, he's guarded, he's chained. He's in a, humanly speaking, impossible situation. But verse 5 says constant prayer was offered to God for him by the church. And so they prayed corporately and quickly. Secondly, they prayed constantly. It's what verse 5 says. It's constant. Consistency. Isn't that one of the hardest things for us to do? To be constant, to be consistent, to be a constant mother 24/7. Isn't it so difficult to be a consistent witness in the workplace or in the family, wherever? Well, here they are, constant. Verse 5 again it says, but constant prayer was offered to God by the church. And though James has been killed, they still prayed on for Peter. They didn't give up. They didn't crumble and say, oh, it's a hopeless situation. Why bother even coming together to pray? It's a done deal. No, God often works in the 11th hour, doesn't he? Isn't that your experience as a Christian? He often stretches us to the end to grow our faith. He tests us and it's often, not always, but often he waits till that what seems like the very last minute before he does that thing that you are burdened that he would do. And it does seem from what the whole scene is in terms of Peter's release that these Christians were gathering together and they are praying late into the night. They were constant in prayer. They're following what Jesus said in his teaching in the Sermon on the Mount to ask and ask and ask and keep on asking until you receive, and you go and knock on that door and you keep knocking and knocking and knocking until the door is open. You keep seeking and you keep seeking until it's something that you find. They are constant in their prayer. They're moved by faith. Persistent, strong, tenacious faith. They prayed constantly. They prayed corporately, they prayed constantly, and very quickly they prayed earnestly. And that's the other sense of this word that Luke uses here, and different translations try to bring that out. So this is not just constant prayer, and certainly not dry prayer. They're not just going through the motions in prayer, and you know what that means when I say that. Going through the motions in prayer. We all do it. They're not going through the motions in prayer. They are earnest in their prayer. Their hearts are engaged. And it is an area where we often fail here, isn't it? I fail. So often prayers being cold, prayers being lifeless. Well, these brethren prayed corporately, they prayed constantly, and they prayed earnestly. And the power of prayer, that prayer, those prayers, such prayers, what did they do? They loosen chains. Such prayers like that swing open what otherwise seem like locked and closed doors. Such prayers like that sets the prisoner free. Such prayers like that shut the mouth of the lion. Constant, consistent, corporate, and earnest prayer. Now, we know the story, so I'm not going to go into all the specifics of it to open it up. You've heard it read. It's dramatic. It's wonderful. God sends an angel in answer to their corporate prayer. Light flashes into his cell. Get up, Peter. Put your jacket on, Peter. Get dressed. His chains fall off him. They walk past the guards. The front iron gate swings open by itself as if it's some sort of modern self-opening mechanism that's working. And even if it goes, no one moves a muscle in the prison. They prayed. And God sent an angel. And we could ask, why didn't God deliver James like he delivered Peter? Well, one answer to that would simply be to say, the secret things belong to the Lord. He doesn't tell us. And he doesn't have to. So we don't need to worry about finding an answer to that question. We just leave it. But we could ask a couple of other questions. I mean, why would you want James to stay around when there's a wicked Herod breathing down your neck? Why would you want James to hang around when there's all these hateful Jews circling the city outside the church, we might say? Why would you want to have James stay around when there's such a hostile devil on this planet? We could argue that James got the better deal than Peter. See? Now we've got a different question to ask. Why did God deliver Peter and not let him go to heaven? God chose to answer the church's prayer according to his own sovereign will. He probably chose to give James, in answer to the people's prayer, to give James the grace that he might finish his race well right to the end, that he might die well. You really want to deny James the presence of Jesus? Yeah, to live is Christ. Amen. But to die is gain. And he gained. Big time. Well, friends, what are the lessons that we can glean from this passage? Well, let me just give 2 lessons to you. There are many more that I could pile up, but just in the interest of time and your capacity to concentrate with me, I'll give you 2. Number 1, faith's inconsistency. I want you to see with me in this passage faith's inconsistency. What do you say? Huh? What do you mean? Well, it's here, I think. It seems that Peter's strong faith enabled him to maybe cry out to God in prayer so that he could sleep, remember, just before the executioner's sword falls on his neck. We see that scene of him sleeping like we did before and we marvel, don't we? We're envious. You're envious if you're an anxious type and you have sleepless nights. I'm anxious. I have sleepless nights. I look on this and think, wow, what faith, what strength of faith Peter had. Friends, we also need to see something else that's behind that. We need to see the special grace of God that was given to Peter in his hour of need. We are not told anything about Peter praying, but it's a little hard to imagine that he didn't pray in that situation. And perhaps he was even able to plead something like the words of Hebrews chapter 4 that are relevant to plead with God in such a time of stress and crisis, where it says, "Let us therefore come boldly to the throne of grace, that we may obtain mercy and that we might find grace to help in the time of need." He was in a time of need, wasn't he? He had a great need. Oh, Lord, how will I face death? I'm scared, Lord. Is this it? Help me, Lord. I need your grace to give me courage. And so special grace was given to answer his prayer so that he could sleep. Special grace, we might say, was given in answer to the church's prayer. He had strong faith so he could sleep. We see that scene. We love that scene. We want to imitate that scene. But then you look again at Peter and you see him standing outside in the street. Cannot you see the same Peter, but something's happened to his faithometer? It's on empty now, or it's certainly on low. He has little faith. He's in shock when he is delivered from prison. He's effectively scratching his head in the dead of the night as he's being taken out of the prison and going out onto that street, and he's scratching himself thinking, am I free? This must be a dream. I'm going to wake up any moment, still chained next to the smelly Roman soldiers. It can't be real. And in that moment we see Peter's faith looked pretty small. He's questioning, we might say. He's in shock. He's like, I thought this was the strong faith, Peter. You see, Peter doesn't greet the angel and say there in the prison to the angel, "Hey, Gabriel, what took you so long? I've been here waiting for you. I prayed in faith with strong faith and you took so long to fly from heaven to get here. I've already got my jacket on, my sandals are strapped on. I'm good to go." That's not what happened. Not at all. Here is Peter in his relatively unbelief. Outside the prison cell, his faith looks very small. And isn't that so much like us? Our faith is up and down, strong one day and seemingly so weak the next. Well, what about the church? What about the local church in Jerusalem? Have they been praying for Peter's release? Surely that was what they were partly at least praying, though we don't have exactly all that we would have been going on in that prayer meeting. Surely that would have been one of the petitions they asked of the Lord. They had persistent faith, we saw that enabled them to keep praying on, though the situation looked humanly impossible. They prayed earnestly, they prayed corporately, and so in that sense they had bold faith. They remained committed. Think of the context. They remained committed to corporate prayer, to gather together midweek when it was probably relatively dangerous to do so. James is already dead. Peter's in prison. Are they going to be next? So it's courageous faith. And then there's a knock on the front gate. Where was their faith at that moment? Rhonda's out there. Rhonda's job, she's a servant girl. She goes out there, and as she recognizes the voice of Peter, which is an interesting expression in itself, she's maybe a member in the church. She's certainly heard Peter many times. She knows Peter. She knows Peter's voice. She recognizes Peter out there in the dark street. There's no street lights in Jerusalem at night. Think of it. She recognizes Peter, this young lady. She's so taken up with joy. She's got a blonde moment. She loses control of her normal rational thinking. And before she knows where she is, she's back inside, over the top, excited and joyful about who is outside on the street. She just can't wait to tell them. Now, what was their reply? Look at verse 14 again. And there's it's almost humour in here, friends. When she recognized Peter's voice, because of her gladness, she did not open the gate, but ran in and announced that Peter stood before the gate. But they said to her, "You loony. You are beside yourself. You are out of your mind, Rhoda. You're losing it, girl. You've been working too hard over recent days and staying up doing all those chores. You need a bit of sleep. You're not thinking correctly. There's something not quite right upstairs with you, Rhoda." "Oh, no. I heard him." And the text goes on to tell us she kept insisting that it was so. So they said, "Oh, it's Peter." They said, "It's his angel." "Okay, Rhoda, we'll humour you. Maybe you did see something out there. It wasn't Peter. We know where Peter is and where Peter's going tomorrow. It couldn't be Peter. Or maybe it's his angel." And that's probably a reflection of a Jewish idea that every believer has their own guardian angel. It's not actually what the Bible teaches, but that was a Jewish idea. What's going on here, friends? Well, we get to see their faith now, don't we? We get to see this young lady's faith. She was insistent. She was persistent. And yet, we see the local church, the church that had gathered together to pray so boldly, so consistent in their prayers, reflecting the depth of their faith in what God could yet do. And yet in the moment after the prayers are prayed, can't be Peter. It must be something else. Your report's wrong. You're wrong. You've got it wrong. Can't be. How many times in prayer is it, friends, that God enlarges our hearts in the act of prayer? He comes and He helps us by His Spirit in His gracious way, and He enables us to pray privately and certainly corporately. We've experienced that, many of us together, over a number of years. God enlarges our vision in the act of prayer. He emboldens our faith that we pray for things in that setting that we don't normally pray in other settings, because God is amongst us, stirring us and helping us as we pray, as we come to His throne. We get it and we understand those words of the old hymn, "Thou art coming to a king, therefore, large petitions with thee bring, for his grace and power are such, none can ever ask too much." Then we leave the place of prayer. We leave the prayer meeting. And we forget. And we doubt what God can do. But then He answers our prayers. And we're left with Peter out in the street scratching our heads. We're left with the congregation inside Mary's house scratching their heads. We're surprised, like Peter was out in the street. We're surprised, like the church is gathered together in her house, because we, like them, have such little faith. Here's one thing to be encouraged with. Thank the Lord that He even sees the faith of a mustard seed. And never forget, the smallest of faith is faith. So number one, faith's inconsistency. And number two, gospel hostility. Gospel hostility. You know, when the news came to the church that James was dead, we're not told anything about that, but can you imagine that scene when the Christians heard, like, James? I mean, it's one thing that Stephen was martyred 10 years ago, that's distant, and he wasn't one of the inner three, but that James is dead? Many heads probably went down at that news when it was announced in church that day. And questions darted through lots of Christians' minds. What did we do wrong? And then when news hit that Peter was now arrested, what do you think they were thinking? Is this due to our lack of faith that Peter was arrested? Is this due to some church sin? I think those questions are worthy to ask, but I think we can also be too quick to jump there in the first place. James is dead. Yep. Peter is about to be killed tomorrow. Yep. And it all looks like as if Satan has the upper hand. Here's the thing I raise with you, friends. When things get bumpy for us as Christians, that isn't necessarily because you have done something wrong. In fact, it might actually be an indication that you are doing something right. This often is the case with gospel churches. I don't mean gospel churches that say they preach the gospel and talk about the gospel. I'm meaning gospel practicing churches where gospel is proclaimed and gospel work is done, and Bible practicing churches. That's what I'm speaking about. Let me share with you an illustration I heard this week. It really fits this issue of gospel hostility. During World War II, when bombers were flying over their targets, and when they were dropping their bombs on the enemy, that was the very time that the incoming flak was always thickest. When you're flying in a bomber and you're one of those pilots and you're flying over somewhere or something that the enemy doesn't want to lose, that's when you feel and receive the thickest incoming of reaction and flak from the enemy. That's when you get the heat. When a church is actively engaged in real gospel work, as the church in Jerusalem clearly was, there is going to be gospel hostility. There is going to be incoming flak. And so even as we just personalize this for us, think in God's mercy what He's been enabling us to do, enabling you to do, many of you. Bible scriptures posted out on our board outside there every week in public view. Bringing non-Christian friends under the sound of the gospel in this setting. Others of you going with gospel literature into the streets. Others teaching the gospel in local schools. An evangelistic Bible study about to start. Christians wanting to join a biblical church and not just go to church, but be a church. Yep, incoming flak can be expected. It doesn't mean that it'll always be. Sometimes the enemy's caught off guard, use the war analogy, but often this is when the income flak is the thickest. But also think about this in terms of personal. Think about in terms of personal trials for you as a Christian. Because that is where we often live, right? As Christians in this hostile world. Now, if you are in one of those places, and it's tempting you, or you have been tempted to think in such a conflict sort of situation, you have been tempted to think that God doesn't love me, don't look at your circumstance to try and measure God's love for you. Don't look, for instance, at a closed door like Peter had. Don't look at some binding situation like chains. Don't look at a difficult relationship perhaps where it seems in your mind there is no escape. Maybe you feel like you're locked into night's darkness. And maybe it seems that the way ahead is impossible. Think of Peter. Chained, in prison, guarded, effectively condemned. Tomorrow, well, it's all gloom and doom. That was not his way to measure the love of God for him. Christ's love for you as a Christian is not measured by your struggles. It is not measured by your seemingly hopeless, impossible, dark situation. Christ's love for you as a Christian is seen and known by looking at the cross. I remind you of the timing of this story. It's Passover time. So the very timing of this was helping surely the Christians. It was pointing them to Jesus, the Passover Lamb. It was pointing them again back 14 years as they saw at where they were, back to Calvary. And so, my friend, your dark night experience or the locked door is not where to see Christ's love. It's at Calvary. God demonstrated His own love toward us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. That's where God demonstrated His clearest evidence of what His love is for you as a believer. And it's because of that cross that you can have hope. Whether the news might be James is dead, or whether the news might be Peter is delivered, you have hope because of the cross. God is still on the throne. Whether James is dead or Peter's delivered, God is still on the throne, working all things after the counsel of His own holy will. Even if you're in a prison cell, He's still on the throne. And so here's those two things. His cross proves his love toward us, and his immovable throne assures his good plans for us. Because of his love, and because he truly rules above and not any lower ruler like a Herod, we can therefore pray to him with confidence. And he wants you to pray. We could say he commands you to pray, because he does. But he wants you to pray, and he wants you to pray with others. It is God's will to gather with the church simply to do nothing else but to pray. Not to avoid the prayer meeting, but to attend and participate in what some have called the church's power room. Is your faith really that strong that you don't need to be united with others around God's throne? Is your faith really that strong? Well, if it is, I'd like to know your secret. Join with us. We are committed to pray together as a people. Powerful things happen when God's people pray together. Powerful things like giving the grace to die well. Not always a deliverance. Powerful things to be given the strength and the courage to face death. Prayer is that communication line of faith that connects us with the all-powerful God. So we have to understand what prayer is. There's a sense in which prayer itself is not powerful. It's what prayer does. It's who prayer connects you to. God is all-powerful. And so prayer is that sense, I am weak, I can do nothing. It's not in the formula of my words or my prayers. It's my heart laid down before God in humility, broken and contrite, and crying out to him who rules all things, who loves his people, who is working all things after the counsel of his will and for the good of those who love him. And that's our God. And he can sustain us in our deepest trials even to the very end. And if he wants to, he can deliver us, even in the very context of rising hostility. May God bless this word, his word, to each of us and to our life together as his people. Let's pray, please.